was 16 and living with my family on a small ranch outside of Redding, California when this happened. The property was very isolated, surrounded by sparse oak woodland. The nearest town was roughly 40 minutes away, which meant that we handled most problems ourselves. We raised goats and kept a small herd of cattle there, and it was a working environment for sure, and not a hobby farm. The first unusual thing occurred with the dogs. We had 3 ranch dogs that were trained to guard the animals and alert us to predators. They were reliable and they never panicked. And one evening at around 9:30, they began behaving really differently. They gathered near the back of the gate, pressed close to the fence, and made some really low whining noises. They were not barking aggressively or showing signs of typical threat behavior. Instead, they were really tense and frozen, staring past the fence and into the darkness beyond our property line. My older brother Ben and I went out to check the perimeter. We used a handheld spotlight and walked the fence line, but nothing was visible. No deer, no coyotes, and no signs of any trespassers. The air was still, and the night felt pretty quiet in a way that didn't fit the usual rural background noise. We returned to the house and we told our father. He dismissed it as an overreaction from the dogs, but his tone suggested that he was uneasy about it as well. He told us not to mention it to our mother, who had been under stress due to a recent medical issue, and so we just sort of left it at that. Well, the next morning, Ben and I found tracks near the fence, which was odd. They were pretty large too, roughly canine in shape, but the stride pattern didn't match any animal that we knew of. The prints showed intermittent upright placement, as if something sometimes walked on 2 legs. The tracks led up to the fence and then paused and then sort of veered away into the scrub. We showed the prints to our father. He examined them quietly and told us again not to tell our mother. He didn't offer any explanation, but he did change the way that he moved around the property afterward, keeping closer to the house, and was sort of way more alert, I guess you could say. 2 days later, while repairing an irrigation line in the back pasture, we heard my mother's voice from the brush line and 20 meters away. She said, "Boys, are you out there?" Ben responded, and the voice answered again, and it was close enough that we should have been able to see her, but we couldn't. My father moved toward the brush to check, but there was nothing and no one there. No movement, no shadows, and no evidence of anyone. The voice stopped, and we waited, and the sound never returned. My father told me to call my mother at that point, and so I did, and she answered from inside of the house, which was really weird. She said that she had been in the kitchen all morning and hadn't even been outside. When I told her what we had heard, she assumed it was a trick of the wind or a misunderstanding. My father didn't argue with that, and he simply told us to pack up and to come back to the house at that point. We didn't have a rational explanation for that, and the voice, it sounded just like her, but it was too clear and like the usual imperfections in her tone, I guess you could say. It felt like maybe like a recording rather than live speech is probably the best way that I could say it. A week later, one of the goats, a large male named Samson, went missing. So we organized a search and took our father's rifle with us as a bit of a precaution. We followed the usual tracks and paths through the brush that we knew about, and about 30 minutes into the search, we noticed the environment changed. The birds suddenly went completely silent, and the usual insect noises was down to nothing. In fact, the silence felt weirdly deliberate. We found Samson near a rock outcrop, and he was dead, but he was also disemboweled, and the internal organs had been arranged around his body in a weird rough circle. The arrangement was not consistent with a typical predator kill by any means and suggested maybe a person had done this, but there were no large animal tracks nearby and there was no drag marks or anything too, which meant that the scene suggested deliberate placement from a person. But who the heck would do this? Ben and I didn't stay to examine it further because we heard some coyotes nearby and their call sounded unusually close and directional, as if they were starting to surround us a little bit. So we ran back to the main trail to get into the vehicle that we came in on. And at one point, Ben looked back and he said that he saw a figure crouched on a rock beside the trail. He said that the figure was human-shaped but moved really strange. He said that it wore a dark garment that resembled animal hide, with the head portion draped over the shoulders. I know that sounds weird, but that's what he said. The face was obscured and it made a sound that wasn't human, an irregular high-pitched noise layered with low growls, which I remember hearing too. The coyote calls seemed to be coming from the same direction though, and sort of synchronized with the figure's movement, so that's sort of what I thought it might have been. The figure though, it moved toward us in a way that did not match typical human movement. It transitioned from standing to a forward crawl, and then allegedly it began sprinting after us as I was driving away, covering ground pretty quickly. Ben fired the rifle at it, which absolutely freaked me out and got me asking what he was shooting at. The figure reacted, leapt off the rock and disappeared into the brush at that point. We returned home immediately after that, obviously, and we told our parents about what had happened. My mother left the kitchen without speaking, and my father sat quietly as if processing the information. He never did question the story or dismiss it too, but he also didn't offer any further action or anything. The next day, our family began preparing to move, and within months we sold the livestock and we relocated to a different state. We never returned to that ranch, and the unusual events were never discussed again. No official reports were filed with anyone or anything, and the only evidence was the tracks and the goat carcass, both of which were removed or lost in the natural environment, I suppose. Now, to be clear, I personally never saw anything. I only heard that sort of growl sound, I guess you could say. But my brother, to this day, swears up and down that what he saw was real. Obviously, too, I saw Samson out there with the organs arranged in the weird way that they were. But my brother swears up and down that he's telling the truth and that he saw what he saw. At the time that this happened, I was 23 years old and living with my father in a house that I'd grown up in. I was employed in rotating factory shifts and had no formal education beyond secondary school. My long-term goal was to move out, but I lacked direction and was managing ongoing mental health issues that were not being treated. My relationship with my father had been deteriorating for years by this point. He believed strongly in rigid life paths and dismissed any alternatives as irresponsible. Arguments were frequent and usually centered on independence, money, and perceived weakness. By early 2021, communication had practically reduced to confrontational exchanges alone, and the household environment had become pretty unstable. During this period, I was contacted by a woman named Rachel, who I dated briefly as a teenager. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade by this point. She reached out and stated that she had recently ended a difficult relationship and had returned to the area. We met several times in public settings, and initially she appeared emotionally grounded and spoke critically of her past circumstances, which meant that I was completely unaware of the extent of her personal instability at that time. My father strongly opposed the renewed contact, but didn't provide specific concerns. His objections, they were basically delivered in the same authoritarian manner that had characterized earlier conflicts. So, I basically ignored him. Within weeks, the arguments escalated to the point where he told me that I needed to leave the house, and so I moved into Rachel's family's home temporarily. The household consisted of her adoptive mother, a stepfather, and an adult stepbrother as well. Rachel's biological father was described inconsistently. Different accounts were given regarding his occupation and involvement in it. Over time, too, I noticed contradictions in their stories, but at the time I interpreted this as family dysfunction rather than deliberate deception. Over the following months, Rachel repeatedly initiated conflicts between me and other members of the household. Statements were misattributed, events were reframed, and private conversations were selectively relayed. Each dispute reinforced the idea that I was isolated and dependent upon her. I became increasingly disconnected from outside support, and so I began drinking pretty heavily. In late summer, Rachel claimed that she was pregnant and stated that leaving would have serious consequences. This information was presented alongside vague threats delivered by other household members. Around the same time, I was pressured into accepting a job through alleged connections that later proved fabricated. I worked briefly in a cold storage logistics facility, but was terminated after a workplace accident caused by inattention and exhaustion. By early autumn, Rachel abruptly left the household, though. When her absence forced direct communication among the remaining adults there, inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. There was a shared realization that much of the conflict had been orchestrated. I was encouraged to stay temporarily while arrangements were made for me to leave, and by this point, I was consuming alcohol daily and experienced persistent anxiety too. Eventually, though, I returned to my father's house in October. Contact with Rachel resumed intermittently through new phone numbers and social media accounts. I blocked each attempt. But then, the knife incident occurred about 3 weeks after my return. So one night, just after midnight, I stepped outside to take out some rubbish. The street was quiet that night, and as I approached the bins, I noticed a figure standing near the hedge, separating our property from the neighboring lot. Immediately, I noticed that the person was holding an object at their side. When I stopped, the individual stepped forward enough for me to see that the object was clearly a knife, a kitchen knife, held openly rather than concealed. The person didn't speak, but based on their posture and clothing, I'm pretty sure that it was Rachel's biological father, who I had met only once. I backed away toward the door without turning around. The individual took several steps forward, but didn't cross the property boundary. I entered the house and locked the door, and from an upstairs window, I observed him remain outside for about another 2 minutes before walking away down the street. No attempt was made to get inside or anything, and there was no further approach that night, but I did report the incident to the police, obviously. But in the end, they basically told me that there really wasn't much that they could do. I was advised to document further incidences and improve exterior lighting as well. And over the next month, there were no additional confrontations as far as I knew of. However, I did notice unfamiliar vehicles passing the house at really irregular hours. Whether these were connected remains uncertain to me, but this is a very quiet place, and it was weird to see that. By November, I ceased all contact entirely. I changed my phone number, closed social media accounts, and limited movement outside of work hours. I stopped drinking, and I began focusing on employment stability as well. Within the following year, I secured a steady job, reduced outstanding debt, and resumed medical care as well. I also found out through the grapevine that, well, Rachel, she was never pregnant at all, and the whole thing was apparently a lie to try and control me. The knife incident remains the clearest indication that the situation had escalated beyond manipulation and now into potential violence. And so I continue to live pretty cautiously, aware of just how easily ordinary circumstances can become unsafe quickly. From the late 1990s through to the early 2010s, my family lived in a prefabricated home on the outskirts of a regional town in eastern Colorado. The house had been installed in the early 1980s and had not been significantly upgraded since then. The layout was linear. My bedroom was located at one extreme end of the structure, separated from the rest of the house by a long corridor that ran past the bedroom, kitchen, and the living area before reaching my parents' room. From the time that we moved in, my bedroom consistently registered colder than the rest of the house. This was noticeable year-round even, and not limited to the winter by any means. We attributed it to uneven insulation, or maybe airflow issues common in older manufactured homes. No one considered it unusual enough to investigate further, and so we just sort of let it be. Now, I was 15 when the incident that stands out most clearly occurred. I woke during the night without any obvious trigger and remained awake, just sort of lying there still. There was no noise, no visible light change, and no sense of urgency, just full alertness. After several minutes, I felt a distinct downward pressure at the foot of the bed, consistent with the mattress compressing as if weight had been applied. The sensation was localized and brief, but unmistakable. I didn't hear footsteps or see movement. I didn't sit up or turn over as well. I was aware that my bedroom door was closed, that my father was working a night shift, that my mother was asleep, and that my younger sibling would not have entered my room without waking me earlier. The house, though, it remained quiet. I didn't look toward the foot of the bed. My response was not panic in the dramatic sense too, but more like a controlled freeze, I guess you could say. Not that I was actually unable to move, but just that I just chose to do that. My heart was pounding and I began sweating though, and I remained awake until morning without moving from that position. Once daylight came, the sensation of threat dissipated entirely and the room felt ordinary again. Over the years, too, there were other incidents that, taken individually, seemed inconsequential. On several occasions, though, I heard my name spoken clearly from somewhere inside of the house. Each time, I assumed it was my mother calling me, but when I responded verbally and checked, no one had called out. These events were sporadic and never happened in quick succession, mind you, and my mother independently reported hearing movement in the hallway late at night often, specifically the sound pattern associated with somebody walking from the kitchen all the way toward the end of the house. She mentioned it more than once, usually in passing, and didn't express fear and only really confusion. Well, we moved out of the house in 2012, and no similar experiences followed in later homes. However, I do continue to have reoccurring dreams involving this specific layout of that house. In the dreams, I avoid entering my old bedroom, and when I do, the emotional response is immediate and disproportionate to the setting. There's no event that occurs in the dream, mind you. It's just that the discomfort is tied only to being in that space for some reason. The consistency of the details, particularly the physical sensation during that night, has kept the memory intact for me in a way that few others from that period have remained. And so I don't know if these dreams mean anything, or if it's just something that has stayed with me because of just how frightening that night really was. In March of 2023, I was living in a shared rental house. The house was a standard 2-story build from the early 2000s with no known issues. I lived there with my younger brother at the time, and the day in question was pretty uneventful for the most part, and didn't follow any arguments, stress, or any sort of unusual activity. So I returned home mid-afternoon after running some errands and assumed that I would be alone. But when I entered the house, I noticed that my brother's shoes were by the door, indicating that he was home. I didn't hear movement or voices or anything, and so I placed my groceries away and decided to rest briefly on the couch in the downstairs living area, rather than going upstairs to my bedroom. I was not fully asleep, and I would describe the state as sort of a light rest with awareness of my surroundings. While laying on my side, I heard my first name spoken quietly from very close. The volume was low, but the articulation was clear enough to be recognizable for sure. Mind you, there was no accompanying movement, breath, sound, or shift in the room or anything. I opened my eyes immediately, thinking that somebody was there, my brother to be precise. But the room was unchanged. Nobody was present. The windows were uncovered and external noise from the street was audible, but I dismissed the experience as a brief auditory misinterpretation and I closed my eyes again, trying to rest. But about maybe 1 or 2 minutes later, I heard my name again. This time the sound was more distinct and slightly closer as well, as if coming directly from beside my head. I suddenly became alert and consciously focused on where this noise was coming from. I remained still for several seconds, then sat up. The living room remained empty, though. A third instance followed shortly after. The sound was quieter than the second, but sustained longer for sure. And at that point, I responded verbally and called out down the hallway toward the bathroom where I could hear the shower running. I walked to the bathroom door and I knocked firmly. My brother responded immediately, sounded confused, and asked what I needed. I asked whether he had called my name multiple times, and he denied doing so, and stated that he had been in the shower the whole time since I had arrived home. I returned to the living room confused, and I didn't attempt to rest again. No further noises were heard that day, and I didn't experience any dizziness, confusion, or disorientation or anything, and there was no environmental factors such as music or TV or external voices that really could account for the sounds. But since that incident, I haven't experienced a repeat of the event in that house or anywhere else. And while I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything, this whole situation is really hard to shake off as just a nothing burger. I am not so sure about what I believe these days after this. The whole thing really shook me, and I know that I heard my name called. In late 2019, while living in a small regional town, I reached a point where I could no longer dismiss a pattern of experiences that had followed me since early childhood. The house itself was pretty ordinary, a 2-story timber structure built in the 1970s, owned by my parents for decades, with no renovations history that would explain unusual noises or any drafts. What changed was not the house, though, but instead my response to what I had been experiencing inside of it. Growing up, unexplained sounds were pretty common in this place. These included footfalls in empty hallways, tapping sounds on internal walls, and occasional knocks that could not be traced to plumbing or animals or anything. At the time, I accepted these as normal household noises. My sister reported similar observations too, but neither of us framed them as anything significant. We were not particularly close growing up, and we didn't compare experiences in detail at all. And so separately, I developed a persistent sense of being observed while alone in this house. This sensation was not accompanied by fear, well, at least during my early years, and didn't interfere with daily functioning at all. Over time, however, the quality of the feeling shifted for sure. By my late teens, it became intrusive and physically uncomfortable rather than neutral or reassuring. Sleep, well, that was a consistent issue. I experienced unusually vivid dreams from a young age. These were not violent or visually extreme or anything, but they were internally coherent in the ways that felt disconnected from ordinary dreaming, like the environments followed their own rules or something, and I often woke with the impression that the dream had continued without me after waking. On several occasions, I spoke aloud upon waking without consciously forming the words. Family members who witnessed these described my speech as fragmented and sort of contextless. I retained no memory of what I had said, mind you, and my mother later commented that during these episodes, my responsiveness appeared really delayed, as if I just wasn't fully awake. Now, in February of 2019, I experienced an event that stood out because it occurred during full wakefulness. So, I was asleep in my bedroom when I woke to the sound of a man exhaling nearby. The sound was quiet but very distinct, consistent with human breath rather than ambient noise for sure. I checked the house and confirmed that I was alone. The family dog was confined to a sort of distant part of the home at the time and could not reasonably have produced the sound anyway. At the time, I really didn't know what to think of it, but I just sort of moved on. The following day, a male relative in his 70s died unexpectedly. The timing, it registered as odd with me, but was not enough on its own to change my interpretation of the prior night. Several weeks later, another incident occurred while I was awake and listening to music late at night one night. I experienced what I can only describe as like a very extreme and sudden drop in temperature, localized though to one side of my body, followed by involuntary shivering. Simultaneously, I became aware of rapid breathing that felt external rather than imagined, as if someone was breathing very close to me. Mind you, there was nobody there, and this was the first time the experience involved a strong physical sensation, rather than just sound or perception alone. The next morning, my family was informed that my grandmother had been hospitalized overnight in critical condition. At this point, I began documenting dates, times, and symptoms rather than attempting to interpret meaning because I got the feeling that this wasn't coincidence anymore. Shortly afterward, I experienced a brief episode during sleep in which I felt pressure applied to my shoulder consistent with being pulled upward. I woke fully this time, but found nobody present, and in the end I just sort of returned to a very restless night's sleep. Over the following months too, my sleep quality declined massively. I began seeing things in like low light conditions, and the routine household noises that I once thought were nothing became more and more difficult to just dismiss. Eventually, I discussed these experiences in detail with my sister for the first time, and she reported similar dreams, almost exactly the same physical sensations, and an overlapping sense of like distinct presences that I felt, though we certainly used different language to describe them. And it was at that point that I began to believe that there was something more going on in this home. Eventually, I moved out of that house, and I had other weird things happen there too, but when I now returned to my childhood bedroom, I still experience that physical response that I always get when I go back there. It always felt like somebody else was in that room with you, no matter what time of the day and no matter how hard you tried to ignore it. And what's really weird too is that my sister said the same thing as well, that she always felt like something or someone was in my room, and it's just something that we lived with for all those years, never really questioning it until now. Back in March of 2022, I was living with my parents in a recently built house on the outskirts of a rural area in eastern Alberta, Canada. The development was pretty sparse, large wooded lots, separated by long gravel driveways, and wildlife activity that was common there. Coyotes, deer, and small mammals regularly moved through the property, especially at night. Because of the isolation too, I think we had developed pretty lax security habits. Vehicles were often left unlocked there, and exterior doors were rarely deadbolted, unless we were away for several days, that is. The routine changed without discussion, and over the course of about a week, I noticed that the exterior doors were constantly locked by early morning. The deadbolt was always engaged, and the motion sensor lights along the rear of the house were being manually checked all the time. On multiple nights, my father used a high-power torch to scan the tree line behind the house after hearing noises, apparently. When I asked what prompted the change, I was told that it was simply better practice, and the conversation ended there. At the same time, too, my sleep had become pretty fragmented. I was waking almost every night between 2:30 and 4 in the morning, regardless of when I went to bed. I wasn't experiencing any panic upon waking or anything, but I rarely returned to sleep afterward as well. Over several weeks, this resulted in cumulative fatigue and difficulty concentrating throughout the day. Now, the rear of the house faced a sort of shallow ravine with dense ground cover out there, a raised deck wrapped around the second floor, and a set of exterior stairs connected the deck to the yard below. My bedroom windows overlooked this area directly, and at some point during my nighttime awakenings, I began hearing movement in the ravine, slow and irregular movement, consistent with something passing through the dry leaves down there. Initially, I assumed it was deer or maybe foxes, though those animals typically avoided approaching the house due to our dog and the parked vehicles there. What made the situation difficult to dismiss, too, was the absence of anything visible when I checked. The sound would stop sort of abruptly as soon as I looked outside, even when I used a flashlight. There was no eye shine, no vegetation moving, and no continuation of the movement away from the house. This pattern repeated several times per week as well, and it got to the point where eventually I just sort of ignored it. Within days, though, of trying to ignore it, the sound suddenly changed. Instead of movement, I began hearing short, isolated noises that resembled familiar household sounds. On one occasion, I heard my mother's distinctive cough coming from the direction of the stairs. She was asleep at the time, though, and she doesn't really wake during the night. On another night, I heard my stepfather's phone ringtone play once and stop, way out there in the forest, of all places. His phone, though, was in the bedroom the whole time, powered on and showed no missed notifications. I checked the next day with him. The most unsettling incident, though, occurred when I heard what sounded like my own voice, calling our dog's name from outside on the deck railing. The cadence and the tone were consistent with how I speak as well, but the sound was faint and sort of slightly distorted, I would say. These incidents, though, occurred over roughly 2 weeks, and none of them were continuous and none escalated after that. But the familiarity of the sounds contrasted sharply with the context there. What I mean is that I didn't hear random voices or unidentified noises. I heard specific, recognizable auditory patterns that I was associated with. I avoided discussing this in detail with my parents in the end. In the past, similar concerns had been attributed to stress or overthinking, and I really didn't expect any other response from them. When I eventually raised the issue indirectly, though, my mother reiterated that the door locking had no specific cause and dismissed the sounds as likely wildlife or imagination influenced by poor sleep. During the daylight hours, though, I inspected the area behind the house. There were no tracks close to the foundation, no signs of tampering near the doors or the stairs or anything, and no damage to any of the gardens or the surrounding forest or anything, suggesting repeated human or large animal presence. Trail cameras weren't installed, and no further investigation ever pursued, but I just could never find any evidence of anything out there. Over time, the sounds stopped occurring, and my sleep eventually did improve. I adjusted my schedule a bit and reduced nighttime isolation so much. And looking back, I guess the most plausible explanation is a combination of, environmental noises, maybe just sleep deprivation and a state of heightened alertness or something. The locking of the doors was always fishy to me and made me think that my parents were not saying something. But, like I said, nothing ever further developed from that situation, and I didn't see anything, and I didn't have a confrontation with anything. I was never able to confirm that anything was actually out there. But still, hearing my own voice out there late at night, that is a really skin-crawling experience and something that I will never forget. Some years back, my family took a guided night tour of the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. That prison, it had been closed for decades and operated as a historical site with occasional after-dark tours marketed toward paranormal enthusiasts. I had done the same tour twice before without any notable experiences. This time, however, something happened that I could not explain with normal logic. So the building that we were in was the cell block known as the cell house, which had a central corridor with cells on both sides and a mezzanine level above. The tour group, it moved through the corridors in small clusters, with the guide pausing to discuss the prison's history from time to time. I separated from my family for a short period to inspect one of the cells on the ground level that was marked with a number that I found significant. I went inside, and obviously I found it pretty empty, but I didn't notice another person until after I had already stepped back out. A woman from the tour group was sitting in a chair inside of the same cell. She had a small electronic device on her lap that was emanating intermittent lights. She was still and appeared to be focused on recording. I apologized at the time for entering the cell and moved out, expecting her to remain where she was. I stood in the corridor for a moment, and then began walking back down toward the center of the cell block to rejoin my family. But before I could take even 3 steps, I glanced back at the cell, and that's when I noticed that it was empty. I returned to confirm, and the chair was cold to the touch, but there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. I remember rationalizing at the time that she must have left quickly without me seeing her, possibly moving through the crowd or something. But then, as I moved toward the stairs leading to the mezzanine, the same woman appeared, walking down the stairwell. She was coming from the opposite side of the cell block, and she looked as surprised as I felt. I asked her directly if she'd been sitting in that cell just a moment earlier. She said no. She stated that she had been on the upper level for at least 20 minutes. We both paused, exchanged a brief look, and then moved away from each other for the rest of the tour. After the tour ended, I could not stop this shaking that I was feeling. The experience just didn't fit any normal explanation. I mean, if she had been sitting in that cell, then I would have seen her there. But if she had been on the upper level, then I wouldn't. It created a contradiction that I just couldn't resolve with a standard explanation like crowd movement or mistaken identity or something like that. I left the site and searched online for similar incidences, and I found references to a concept at the time that I'd never heard of but was called doppelgangers, an identical double that appears without explanation. The information that I found was not scientific by any means, but it did match the structure of what had happened to me. A person seen in one place and then confirmed to have been elsewhere, and I know that I saw them. I never did say anything to the tour operators, and I didn't seek out any additional paranormal investigation after that. I also didn't experience anything after that. It was just that one incident. In the months that followed, I did do some research, but again, I just haven't been able to come up with an explanation for how this is even possible. Which means that, to me at least, the incident remains unresolved, and I cannot figure out for the life of me how the heck she was in 2 places at once. When I was 9 years old, my family moved from a coastal town in northern Ecuador to a rural settlement in the Colombian Amazon. The house we rented was a raised wooden structure with a wide back platform that overlooked a slow-moving section of the river. There was no electricity, and the only light at night came from oil lamps and the occasional lightning strike. The river was part of the local economy there, though, but it was also pretty dangerous. My mother repeatedly told me not to go near the water alone because of the caimans and the strong current. During the afternoons, I would often spend time on the platform watching that river. It was one of the few activities available to a child in that area, to be honest. The river was always moving and always changing, and I would stand for long periods simply observing the flow. One afternoon I was on the platform too when I became aware of a presence behind me. I turned and I saw 6 children standing in a line just feet away from me. They were all very pale with light hair and light eyes, and none of them were wearing any clothes. That detail was the first thing that registered as abnormal because I had never seen children like that in the village, and the only people who were normally around were locals or workers from nearby settlements. There were really no foreign visitors here, and there were certainly no blonde children. The children didn't speak, and they simply sort of just stood there, looking at me, and then began to move in a circle. I felt no immediate fear, and I was a kid, and their presence felt sort of neutral and non-threatening. I started to join them, and for a short period we sort of ran in a circle together. I remember placing my hands on the shoulders of the child in front of me and feeling their skin. There was no difference between them and any other child in terms of physical contact. They didn't react when I touched them, but neither did they resist or anything. After a few minutes, the group stopped moving and they all turned their heads to one side simultaneously, as if they had detected something that I couldn't. I followed their gaze and saw what appeared to be an oval-shaped opening in the air, like a dark patch that had not been there before. The opening was not sharp-edged, and I struggled to describe it at the time, but now I can say that it looked a lot like a portal. It genuinely looked like a tear through space itself right in front of me. And one by one, the children walked toward the opening and stepped through it. I was at the end of the line and moved forward to follow, but just as I reached the edge, the opening just suddenly closed, and it shut in a way that was sudden and just complete, leaving no gap. I was left standing there, alone on the platform, wondering if what I had just experienced was even real. I called out for the children, but there was no response. I remember waiting for several minutes, running around the platform in circles, hoping that they would return, but they never did. Eventually, I think that I went inside the house, and my mother saw that I was missing my clothes and became angry at me. She asked why I had taken them off like that, and I struggled to explain it. I just didn't really have the words at the time, and I think I remember saying that there were kids out there and I was playing with them, but she didn't believe me. For the next few years, I didn't think about that incident too much. I mean, it certainly stayed in my memory, but it didn't feel like something that required an explanation. The event only resurfaced when I was older and began reading about unusual encounters. I had access to an encyclopedia set in the Bronx at the time and would read for hours. And in the section on classical sculpture, I saw images of child figures with similar physical traits to the children that I had seen. Pale skin, light hair, no clothing, and that visual similarity made the memory feel more concrete. So later, I read a book on alleged encounters with non-human entities that described Nordic beings with similar physical characteristics. The book suggested that these things appeared in remote areas and were often mistaken for human children because of their appearance, which certainly matched up with my experience. And while I don't claim to really know what happened that day, I'm also convinced that I saw those children, that they were there and they were real. I mean, I even touched one. Again, I really don't know how to explain it, but I do know that something happened that didn't fit any ordinary explanation. and the memory has remained consistent over decades now. What I mean by that is that I'm not misremembering anything, and the details are very clear to me. I don't know what the conclusion is to all of this or what any of this means, but I will never forget those children, and also the portal that they went through. So my partner and I were living in upstate Vermont when this happened. We had a routine of walking our dog after work, usually along a multi-use trail that followed a disused rail line. The trail was close to our house, about a 10-minute drive away, and it was one of those few places nearby where we could walk without crossing roads or dealing with heavy traffic. On this particular day, it was late afternoon and the light was fading. The trail had some solar-powered lights installed at regular intervals, but they were pretty dim, and the area between them was noticeably darker too. The park itself was mostly empty. There were a few cyclists near the parking area, but nobody else on the trail. We were about 30 minutes into the walk when I started to feel like someone was watching us. It was a subtle sensation, but it made me stop and sort of look ahead for a little bit. And about 25 meters in front of us, between two pine trees, there was an object that didn't fit the environment. It was a white, featureless shape, floating about 1.5 meters above the ground. It didn't have a defined outline, but it maintained a consistent form. It sort of resembled a strip of white fabric held taut, or maybe a rectangular patch of glare on a screen is a better way to put it. I pointed it out to my partner, though, and he immediately saw it too, and we both stopped walking. The object remained in place for roughly 10 seconds, then it shifted position in a way that suggested deliberate movement. It moved laterally behind a tree and paused, then reappeared briefly at the edge of the tree's trunk. The motion was not like anything that we had ever seen before. There was no visible mechanism, no branches moving, no animal-like motion. It was simply a white mass that appeared to change location. Our dog noticed the movement though too, but he didn't react aggressively. He sort of looked toward the shape, then looked back at us, clearly confused, and then continued to stand still. The lack of reaction from the dog made the situation feel even more unsettling in a way though, because we expected him to either bark or maybe pull toward it or something. After the object moved behind the tree, it didn't reappear after that. The moment it moved, my body responded as if a threat had been confirmed though, and my partner and I began walking back quickly and then started jogging even, and eventually we found ourselves running back toward the parking lot. We didn't talk much on the way back, and I think we were both sort of processing what we had just seen, but when we reached the car, we sat inside for a few minutes before leaving. And that's when we noticed that apparently we had been gone for about 3 hours, which made absolutely no sense to us. Neither of us wanted to return to the trail, and we didn't tell anyone about it for several weeks. The incident affected our behavior afterward too, which was a bit weird. We stopped taking evening walks and began choosing locations that felt more open and less wooded. And I began having these really weird dreams about seeing weird faces that I don't know what that is, but we discussed several potential explanations afterward, and we considered the possibility of a drone, but there was no sound and no lights, and the movement didn't match anything that we could identify. And believe me, we looked. We thought about a balloon or maybe a piece of debris caught in the thermal current, but the object moved with intent, and the way that it paused and reappeared suggested that it was aware of us too. We also considered that it could have been a trick of the light, I suppose, maybe like an optical illusion caused by dim lighting and maybe the contrast between the white object and the dark forest. But the fact that both of us saw it, and our dog even, and that it moved in a way that didn't align with natural phenomena, made that explanation way less convincing. We never did return to that trail at dusk, and eventually the dreams stopped, which I was thankful for, but I really don't know what that was, and I also just don't know how to explain how we were gone for that long when the most we could have been gone for really was maybe 20 minutes at most. And so, where did all that time go? When I was about 10 years old, my family traveled to the remote northern region of Nepal, near the border with Tibet. We were staying with some relatives in a small village built on the side of a mountain there. The area was very isolated, and the houses were very spread apart as well, with large gaps between them. There were no streetlights there, no nearby towns, and the sky, the night sky that is, was so completely dark that you could basically see every star out there. That was something that I never forgot, and was truly amazing at the time to me. We had been there for a few days as well, and my sleep had been unusually deep, and I was adjusting quickly to the altitude. The first few nights were quiet as well. I was falling asleep quickly. One night, though, my father and I stayed up later than the rest of the family. My sister had already gone to bed, and it must have been around 11:30 when my dad suggested that we step outside to look at the stars one more time. He knew that I was interested in astronomy, and this was one of the few places that I had ever been where the sky was clear enough to see constellations without light pollution like this. We walked a short distance away from the house to avoid the light from the doorway, and the path led toward a sort of small clearing area with low shrubs on either side. The ground sloped sharply downward beyond the clearing, creating a sort of drop-off, and we stopped about 2 meters from the edge for safety. It was very quiet. There was no wind, no insects, no distant animal sounds. In fact, the lack of the ambient noise felt a bit weird. I remember that, but I didn't fully process it at the time. I was so focused on the stars in the sky. My father had a small flashlight to guide us out there, and we were about halfway between the house and the edge when we heard movement in the bushes to our right. My dad immediately turned the flashlight in that direction, and a dog-like animal suddenly stepped into the light. At first glance, it looked like a stray dog, but something about its shape was wrong. The face was the first thing that made me very uneasy. The eyes were dark and matte with no reflective shine. They appeared as empty voids rather than eyes, really, and the animal held its head at a really weird angle, staring directly at me without blinking. The body didn't match any dog that I had ever seen before. What I mean is that the legs were longer than normal, way longer, and the joints seemed higher up than they should have been, and there were more of them too. The fur looked slick but didn't appear to be wet, and the neck was unusually long. The animal's posture felt really weird too. I didn't immediately recognize it as dangerous. I mean, I was a kid and I'd grown up around stray dogs in urban India. My instinct was to approach and pet it, and so I stepped forward and extended my hand, but my father grabbed my shoulder firmly and whispered for me to stop. At first, I assumed he was being overly cautious because this dog might be wild or rabid, but his face told me otherwise. He looked tense and scared, and he didn't speak loudly, but his body language made it clear that he was serious. He said to me, "Don't touch it." I looked back at the animal, and it moved a small step forward, but it didn't run. It simply shifted its position slightly, while keeping its gaze completely fixed on me. That intensity of that stare made my skin suddenly go cold too. It didn't look like an animal that was about to flee. Instead, it looked like it was sort of evaluating me and my father. My father switched off the flashlight, and the darkness returned immediately. The animal, or whatever it was, it disappeared as soon as the light went out too. There was no sound of it moving through the bushes, no rustling and no snapping of branches. In fact, I remember thinking at the time how weird it was that it simply just vanished like that. We stood still for several minutes after that. I guess my father was expecting the animal to reappear or to move away into the darkness, but nothing happened. But there was really nowhere for it to go, and at the time I remember thinking that this was weird. The mountain slope behind us was steep and rocky, and the shrubs were dense, and there was no clear path for an animal to escape silently. After a moment or two, my father quickly led me back toward the house without speaking. He didn't explain what we had seen, and he didn't mention it again that night. The rest of the family didn't notice anything unusual, too. The next day, I felt physically really unwell, too. I had a headache and nausea, which I attributed to the altitude and the lack of oxygen. I didn't connect it to the encounter until much later. Several days later, I learned something about that area that made the incident more concerning, I guess you could say. The locals mentioned that strange animals had been seen near the village, but that they didn't talk about it openly for some reason too. My father also stopped taking late-night walks after that, and he became more cautious about leaving the house after dark as well, and seemed to be really vigilant around us kids. We never did see anything again, and I didn't tell anyone at the time because I assumed that they would have dismissed me or treated me as a child with a child's imagination. And so, in the end, I just sort of kept the memory to myself and occasionally mentioned it to my dad. Years later, though, I started to question what it could have been. I mean, the most reasonable explanation that I could find is that it was a stray dog with a medical condition or a deformity or something. Maybe it was a wild animal that was common in that region, although I never could find anything that matched the description. Also, the behavior of the animal and the fact that it disappeared without making any sound, well, that always seemed a bit weird to me. The only thing that I know for certain is that I saw this weird thing, and I don't know what to make of it. It vanished without making noise when the light was removed, and the experience changed how I viewed that environment and made me way more cautious for the remainder of my trip there. I still don't know what it was, and I have no reason to claim that it was like a ghost dog or anything like that. I only know that it was real enough to affect me for years afterward, and my father, who also saw it. My family has owned a small lakeside cabin in rural Maine for decades now. It's the kind of place where the nearest neighbor, well, it's a long walk away, and the only real sounds at night are the wind through the pines and the occasional loons on the water. We've always treated it like a safe, quiet retreat for the most part. Last summer, I stayed there with my cousins again. The cabin itself only has a couple of bedrooms, so we built a small separate sleeping area behind it. We call it the sleep shed, and it's basically a tiny insulated room with a bed, a small window, and a door that faces the driveway. We use it only during the summer months, and we lock the door at night, even though we don't usually worry about security there. Now, I'd been sleeping in the sleep shed with my younger cousin, and I woke up earlier than her. It was still early morning, but light enough to see outside at this stage. I remember thinking that it was pretty strange because I hadn't been awake that early in years. So I lay there for a few minutes trying to go back to sleep when I heard footsteps. At first, I assumed it was something or someone walking along the driveway, and maybe one of my family members going to get something. But the sound didn't move away from the shed. It circled around it. The steps, they were heavy and deliberate, and they had a distinct sound that I associated with hard-soled shoes on loose gravel. The footsteps went around the shed once, then twice, then kept going. The sound wasn't fading, it just kept coming. It sounded like someone was deliberately walking around the sleep shed, staying close to the building and not moving away. I sat up and looked out the window. The sleep shed faces the driveway, and I could see the gravel clearly. I expected to see a person's head or a silhouette as they passed by. I waited for a long time, in fact, but nothing ever appeared. No shadow, No movement and no figure. The steps continued and I started to feel a real sense of exposure, like I was being watched and there was no place to hide. I didn't want to wake my cousin, so I stayed still for as long as I could, and eventually I decided to call out for my dad. I crawled out of my bed, grabbed my phone, and I dialed him. My cousin woke up at that moment and asked what was wrong too. I told her what I was hearing, and she didn't seem alarmed at first, which made me even more nervous, to be honest. She looked at me like I was overreacting, and that certainly didn't help, so I kept listening. My dad, he came out a few minutes later. He walked around the outside of the sleep shed and listened for a bit. He didn't hear anything after a while and told me that it was probably an animal. He didn't seem worried at all, and he didn't think that there was anything to be afraid of. But that's when I started questioning that explanation. You see, animals don't walk in circles around a small building like that, and even if they did, their footsteps wouldn't sound like shoes. Deer, they have soft feet, and they move really quietly. Raccoons, foxes, and other animals that might be in the area, they don't make heavy, consistent footsteps like that. If it were a human, I should have seen something out of the window at least, or maybe even at least heard a voice or seen a shadow or something. But the noise went on for at least 10 minutes. It didn't stop abruptly too, it just faded slowly. When it ended, there was no sound of someone leaving the area as well, like no vehicle or no running away and no breaking branches or anything like that. Just, well, silence. My dad eventually went back inside and I just tried to calm down. My cousin, they went back to sleep and I stayed awake for the rest of the morning trying to rationalize what had just happened. Later that day, I asked my dad if he remembered anything else about that morning, and he said that he didn't hear anything unusual and that he thought that I was just scared because I was alone. He told me to forget about it and just focus on the day and not to worry too much. So I tried to do that, but really I just couldn't. The memory just kept coming back to me, the way the footsteps moved, the fact that they didn't sound like an animal, the fact that I couldn't see anyone. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about it too. I started looking for logical explanations. One idea was that it could have been a neighbor walking their dog, or maybe a hiker or someone checking the property, I suppose. But there was no sign of anyone. No car tracks, no voices, no evidence that anyone was even near the cabin. Another possibility was that the sound was amplified by the structure of the sleep shed. Maybe the gravel was arranged in a way that made even small noises sound louder. But the footsteps were too consistent. It wasn't random and it was way too deliberate. The only thing that made sense to me was that someone was walking around the sleep shed. But why would they do that without being seen? Why would they keep circling, and why would they not make any other noise as well? I asked other family members if they had ever experienced anything similar at the cabin, and they said no. They didn't believe me either. Some even said that I was making it up to be dramatic. I don't think that I'm the kind of person who imagines things, though, and I'm not usually scared of the woods or being alone at all. I've been around my cabin my whole life, but this incident, well, it just felt different. It felt intentional, like someone or something wanted to let me know that it was there. I never saw anyone, but I certainly felt like I was being observed, and I think that's what bothered me most. Anyway, a few weeks later, I noticed something else. The lock on the sleep shed door, it was slightly loose. It wasn't broken, but it looked like it had been used recently. The lock had never been like that before, but my dad insisted that it was just old and that the humidity could have caused it, but it made me think. If someone had been circling the sleep shed, perhaps they had tried the door at some point. Perhaps they were checking to see if it was locked, and maybe they were looking for someone inside or something. I never did mention this to my family because I didn't want to cause panic or be accused of making things up or anything. But I started sleeping with the door locked and the window covered. I also started keeping my phone nearby and staying awake longer at night. Now, I'm not sure what I heard that morning. I obviously don't have any proof or anything. I don't have any evidence even. I only really have the memory of the sound and the feeling of being watched. But someone out there at that time of the morning on private property, they cannot be up to anything good, right? The incident has stayed with me all these years, and it's always changed how I feel about being alone in remote areas. In fact, I never assume the woods are safe anymore. But while I don't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else, something tells me that it was a person, and that they were up to no good. In early 2022, I moved into a townhouse development on the outskirts of a mid-sized city in western Pennsylvania. It was a quiet area with a mix of owner-occupied homes and short-term rentals. The neighborhood backed up against a publicly owned greenbelt that was technically protected land but loosely maintained. There were walking paths, tree cover, and no fencing beyond the property lines there as well. Within a few weeks of moving in, I started noticing the same man walking past my house with a dog. This wasn't unusual on its own, but what stood out was the consistency. I saw him multiple mornings per week as I left for work at around 7:15 in the morning, and I often saw him again in the late afternoon when I'd return. He appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s, average height, average build. He wore the same dark grey jacket regardless of the weather conditions. Initially, I assumed we simply had overlapping routines. I didn't pay much attention to him beyond registering that he just was a regular presence. Over time, however, I noticed that he didn't really vary his route, like ever. He passed directly in front of my unit every time. He also maintained prolonged eye contact when I crossed paths with him, which I found mildly uncomfortable but not alarming. And the first interaction that we had was brief and very awkward. I asked him whether the homeowners association had sent out a quarterly notice regarding landscape changes. He paused for a minute before responding that he hadn't seen anything. He didn't ask any follow-up questions or offer any commentary, and after that he resumed walking without so much as acknowledging me, really. The interaction didn't feel hostile by any means, but just socially off, I guess. Anyway, by the end of the year, I was seeing him daily at this stage. In February of 2023, my partner moved out following a separation as well, and this left me living alone for the first time in several years. Around that same period as well, my mother stayed with me temporarily during the weekdays while I was at work. She independently noticed the man as well, and commented on how often he passed the house. She also noted that he never spoke and that his attention seemed fixed rather than casual. We discussed possible explanations, including maybe cognitive issues, and we concluded that there was likely no threat. After my mother left, I began spending more time in the backyard during the evenings. The yard was pretty small and bordered by a wooden fence that separated my property from the greenbelt. Late at night, I occasionally heard movement beyond the fence line, and at some point I sort of noticed that the sounds were rhythmic rather than random, resembling slow walking rather than animal movement. Because I was drinking heavily at the time, I discounted these experiences as either impaired perception or just common wildlife activity. Over several weeks, I noticed small inconsistencies though. Items left outside were moved or even missing. Cigarette lighters, half-used packs, and an ashtray were not where I remembered leaving them. Again, though, I attributed this to my own habits. In late spring, though, two relatives began coming over on weekends to help with minor repairs around the place. During these visits, the man with the dog would stop near the property line and just stand there and watch silently. He extended the dog's leash toward them on multiple occasions. The dog appeared poorly groomed and had a really bad smell. My relatives were pretty uncomfortable with the situation and told him to leave after one incident as well. He didn't respond verbally, but he did comply. But after that, his behavior shifted. He continued walking past the house, but now stopped outright when I arrived or departed, turning his body to track my movement. This was not fleeting attention by any means as well. What I mean is that it was sustained and very deliberate. In June, a co-worker moved into the spare room. She worked a different schedule, though, at the time, and independently reported seeing the man multiple times per day. She also noted that he positioned himself near the property at predictable hours. She initially interacted with the dog, but stopped eventually due to discomfort. After that, she reported that the man's demeanor became noticeably hostile as well, though still silent. The event that changed my interpretation, though, that occurred in late July. So while driving home one day, I saw the man leave the sidewalk near the neighborhood entrance and enter into the tree line leading into the greenbelt. He didn't appear to be following a marked trail or anything, and this reframed everything for me. The constant presence, the odor, the timing, the lack of social interaction, and the unexplained activity behind my fence began to align into a single hypothesis. The man was not merely walking his dog. He was spending extended time in the wooded area directly behind my property for who knows what reason. At the time, the adjacent unit to my house was vacant. It had been empty for months, in fact, and I realized that I first noticed the man shortly after the previous tenants moved out. I then began planning to install motion-activated cameras facing the rear fence line, but before I could do so, the vacant unit was rented. A family moved in, including children and a dog. The day that the moving truck arrived was the final time that I saw the man walking past my house, because after that, I never did see him again. Weeks later, though, I spoke casually with the new neighbors, and I asked whether they had found anything unusual behind their yard while clearing brush. And they mentioned discarded items, but didn't really elaborate too much. I didn't press the issue at the time, too. I lived in that house for over 2 more years, and there were no further incidences, no footsteps, no sightings, no missing items, and I never did see the man again. I don't know whether the man was living in the Greenbelt, using it as a temporary shelter, or simply spending large amounts of time there, perhaps watching me or something. I have no proof that he ever entered my property. I also have no direct evidence that his presence was criminal, but still, with everything that happened, it definitely seems suspicious. Especially because once the conditions changed, well, I never did see him again. That was enough for me to conclude that what I experienced was not random and that this guy was probably stalking me. And so, after a little over 2 more years of living there, eventually I moved out. In August of 2021, I became aware of a location circulating through multiple urban exploration forums and other platforms online that I frequented. The posts all referenced the same structure, a vacant industrial building on the outskirts of Tacoma, Washington. The primary point of interest was a large suspended figure inside of the building. I recognized the character immediately. I had played the game extensively as a teenager, and the idea of a full-scale physical version stood out enough to me that I followed several of the accounts sharing footage. The videos were short and inconsistent, often filmed at odd angles. None of them showed much of the surrounding environment or explained why the installation even existed. But after sending a private message to one of the posters, I received directions rather than a formal address. The location was described relative to an old freight spur and a disused access road. I shared the information with a friend who was pretty familiar with the game as well, and so we agreed to visit during the daylight hours. We arrived just before 5 p.m. The building was a single-story concrete warehouse set back from the road a bit. There were no signs, fencing, or visible security measures at all. Most of the windows were sealed from the inside with some sort of material. The structure appeared inactive but recently abandoned. One exterior door was unsecured. It opened without resistance. Inside, visibility was pretty low but adequate due to the diffused daylight filtering in through the covered windows. The interior space was cluttered but orderly. Industrial shelving, unused tools, and boxed items were stacked in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than neglect. There were also multiple piles of children's toys, sorted by type rather than being scattered. Several feet from the entrance, though, centered in the main bay, was the suspended figure. It was larger than anticipated. The figure was roughly human height, in fact, and constructed with accurate proportions. It appeared to be fabricated from layered fabric and padding rather than foam or plastic or whatever, but it was attached to a wooden frame resembling a gallows, with a rope loop secured around its neck area. The structure was stable and professionally assembled, it seemed. As we moved closer, a strong odor became noticeable, though. It was localized rather than everywhere, and the smell was like something had died in there. It intensified rapidly as distance decreased, and that indicated a specific source rather than it just being all around us. So we followed our noses, and near the base of the wooden structure was an arrangement of objects placed deliberately on the floor. These included damaged toys, a religious image taped to a crate, and a framed photograph of an adult male. The individual in the photograph had a shaved head and eyebrows and appeared to be posing deliberately. Next to the photo was an old cassette tape with a music compilation label from what I would guess is the late 90s. The air in this area felt markedly cooler, though, than the rest of the warehouse. This was not consistent with the ventilation as well. Closer to inspection of the suspended figure, it revealed discoloration in several areas of the fabric. These stains were darker and irregular, and when we got near it, the odor became overwhelming. Remaining in place without covering our faces was not possible now, and written in permanent marker on the central vertical beam of the wooden structure was a full name. I won't be saying it here, but the handwriting appeared intentional and pretty recent as well. Well, we exited the building without any further exploration because we were too spooked to keep going. Later that evening, though, we searched the name online and the results were pretty limited. There were some fragmented references across social media platforms, primarily short videos showing erratic behavior, but no formal records or contextual explanation that could make sense of anything. There was no missing person reports or news articles that clearly aligned with the name and the circumstances too. In the days following, I monitored the same accounts that originally posted the footage of the location. Several videos were removed eventually, and another one was uploaded of the same warehouse but with the figure in the middle now gone. Others stopped referencing the site entirely, and I never did return to that warehouse. Now, I don't know if there was something weird going on, or maybe if someone had sprayed something upon that figure, or I don't know. Maybe there was something in there, or maybe not. Or maybe I should say someone was in there, or maybe not. But the smell, it smelt like death, and I really don't like to think about that. I was just under 13 years old when this happened, living in a mid-sized residential town outside of a major city. At the time, my household consisted of my parents, myself, and my two younger siblings. Up until that year, childcare responsibilities were handed exclusively by relatives or neighbors. That arrangement changed when my parents decided that I was old enough to stay home with my siblings for short periods, though. The situation I'm describing, it took place on the first evening that I was left in charge. So, my parents had planned to attend a movie followed by dinner with some friends. They explained in advance that they would likely return after midnight. This wasn't completely unusual for them too, but it was the first time that they had done so without arranging adult supervision. The evening itself was pretty unremarkable, to be honest. My siblings and I stayed in the living room, watched television with the lights off, something that we were not normally allowed to do, but hey, we were alone and we could basically do what we want. The house was quiet though, and we lived in a pretty quiet neighborhood as well. But around 10:45, I noticed a sound coming from the front yard. It was intermittent and light, and I couldn't quite tell what it was at first. I ignored it though for the most part, but several minutes later, there was a sudden impact against the front door. The force was strong enough to cause the door frame to vibrate. This was followed by a second strike, louder than the first one. And at that point, we turned off the television and we just sort of remained silent, not knowing what to do. I didn't consider opening the door. I mean, the house was secured and I had been explicitly instructed not to answer it under any circumstances while my parents were away. The banging resumed though, followed by movement at the handle. The handle turned once, then again, with enough pressure that the latch audibly shifted. The door, thankfully, didn't open. The person outside, they never spoke. Our only landline phone was mounted on the wall near the entrance, so I decided against using it, concerned that the noise would confirm our presence. Instead, I directed my siblings upstairs to my parents' bedroom, which overlooked the front of the house. From that room, the front entrance was partially visible through a gap between the curtains. We remained on the floor initially, but then slowly raised ourselves enough to look outside without moving the fabric. Standing on the front path was an adult male, likely elderly based on posture and build, and he was facing the house directly. He was holding a paper bag or something like that in one hand, and the other hand was raised, pointing toward the bag in a slow, repetitive motion. He never attempted to hide himself, nor did he move toward or away from the house while we were watching him. There was no visible attempt to force entry at that point, and he didn't speak, wave, or otherwise signal. The entire observation lasted only a few seconds before we withdrew from the window. After several minutes, I checked again from a different angle, but whoever they were now gone. The front yard and the footpath, they were empty. We remained upstairs until our parents returned, and when they arrived, we explained what had occurred. My father inspected the exterior of the house, and he found a lot of damage on that front door. A report was made to the local police the following day, but I don't think that there was any real follow-up or anything like that. In the years since then, though, I have revisited the event many times in my head, and now that I'm a lot older, the most likely explanation appears to be a confused or maybe impaired individual who approached the wrong residence or whatever. The bag, well, that was probably likely alcohol or something like that. But still, though, if he had managed to have gotten in that night, I really don't know what we would have done. I really do just thank God that that door frame held for as long as it did. So I was in my second year of university, living as a student, alone in a subsidized apartment complex. I was 22 years old and working part-time while attending evening classes. My housing choice was driven by cost and also proximity to public transportation rather than comfort or security. The building itself, it was aging, with shared hallways, minimal access control, and on-site security that functioned primarily during peak hours only. The day the incident occurred followed a modified version of my usual schedule. A technical issue at my workplace caused an early closure in the afternoon, which meant that I returned home several hours earlier than normal. After a brief stop at my apartment, I left again to attend classes and later visit a friend. I I returned to my building close to 10:30 using a rideshare service, as I generally avoided public transport late at night as much as I could. While entering the building, I noticed an unfamiliar man seated near the stairwell on the ground floor. He wasn't interacting with anyone and wasn't dressed in a way that suggested that he worked there. I didn't engage with him and just assumed that he was either waiting for somebody who lived there or passing time. Things like this were not completely unusual in this place, but I locked my apartment door upon entering, prepared a simple meal, and spent the next hour watching some TV. I would say it was probably around 11:15 when I heard a loud impact sound coming from the hallway, followed immediately by pressure against my door. And then the door opened partially before stopping suddenly, likely due to the internal latch. I moved to the bathroom, locked the door, and contacted a friend who lived nearby. He arrived within 10 minutes, and by that time, the hallway was quiet again. We inspected the apartment and found no signs of theft or disturbance inside. The door frame showed some minor damage consistent with somebody trying to get in, but thankfully the damage seemed pretty minimal. We then went to the building security office to request footage from the hallway cameras. After some delay, the guard accessed the recording, and the footage showed the same individual that I had seen earlier entering the hallway and approaching my apartment. In fact, he followed me the whole way up. He manipulated the lock and he opened the door before abruptly leaving all of a sudden, moving quickly toward the building's exit. The guard stated that he had noticed the individual entering due to high foot traffic during that time window, but I know it was just because he was probably preoccupied with something else. The guards there were just terrible, to be honest. Local police were contacted, though, and they reviewed the footage. They canvassed the residents on the floor and the adjacent units, and nobody recognized this person. The video quality was sort of insufficient for clear identification, but there were some fingerprints recovered from the door. In the weeks that followed, I contacted the police twice for updates, and on the second occasion, they gave me some very disturbing information. So, apparently, this guy was known to the police. He had been locked up before, and at first they wouldn't give me any information as to what he was locked up for, but then one of the female officers who I spoke on the phone with basically said to me that this guy was a known criminal and had been known to, well, assault people, is how she put it. I don't know exactly what that means, but obviously it sounds terrible, and so I got some extra security for my door from that point, and I always made sure to check behind me as I was going about my business, especially when I was coming home. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that, and really, I think I just got lucky that day. Watching the footage, it seemed like the guy got spooked by something, that he backed out at the last second perhaps, because honestly, that chain, well, he could have broken it very easily. This took place during the early morning hours of January 1st, 2022. On New Year's Eve, I had attended a private gathering in a residential neighborhood outside of the city center. The event followed a typical pattern as well, that was alcohol, music, and people arrived and left in staggered intervals throughout the night. I didn't feel unsafe or anything at the gathering itself, and I remained in control of my decisions despite the drinking, but probably at about 6:30, I decided to leave. I opened a rideshare app that I used at the time, due to lower fares during off hours. A driver accepted the request within minutes, and shortly afterward, a friend suggested that I should wait so that we could leave together. So I cancelled the ride, but after further discussion, it became clear that our departure times would not align. So I placed a second request, which was accepted almost immediately. A friend accompanied me to the building entrance as the door required manual locking after exit. The vehicle was parked outside and matched the general description listed in the app. I didn't verify the license plate number, which was a huge mistake in hindsight. Now, upon entering the car, I noticed a general sense of discomfort that I initially attributed to fatigue. The driver began speaking immediately and directing questions toward the friend who had walked me downstairs. He asked whether the friend was my partner, why he was watching the car, and whether I lived alone. I responded briefly and attempted to redirect the conversation. As the trip continued, the driver asked additional personal questions unrelated to the route. He commented on the length of my evening, my alcohol consumption, and whether I was returning to an empty apartment. These questions, they were framed casually but were very persistent. So in the end, I just stopped engaging. It was around this time too that I noticed just how hot the car was. There was no visible phone mount, and though navigation audio was playing at high volume, I didn't see any GPS anywhere. When I attempted to lower the window using the control panel, it also didn't respond. I asked the driver kindly to turn the heat down or maybe just open a window or something. He initially refused and stated that the system was functioning properly, but after further insistence, he unlocked the doors and I manually opened the window. At this point, he made a comment about being cooperative and framed the interaction as a favor. The remark was pretty unnecessary and heightened my concern, to be honest, but I began monitoring our direction more closely. Within minutes, it became clear that the route did not correspond with the address entered into the app. We were now traveling away from my neighborhood and toward an industrial zone with limited pedestrian traffic. I waited until the car slowed for a red light before I addressed everything. I asked why we were no longer heading toward my destination. He paused before answering and responded by questioning whether I was certain about where I wanted to even go. His tone shifted, and then he turned partially toward me rather than watching the road. It was at that moment that I knew that something was wrong, and so I just jumped straight out of the vehicle. The car had not come to a full stop, but the traffic was halted, and we were driving pretty slow, so I opened the door and I moved away quickly. The driver exited the vehicle briefly, shouted for me to come back, and then re-entered the car, and he accelerated aggressively before driving away. I contacted friends immediately and described the situation. Some of them were skeptical and said that I was just overreacting. This reaction discouraged me from pursuing the matter further at the time as well. But then I spoke to the guy who had taken me downstairs, and he said to me that the real driver apparently showed up afterward. He remembered me talking about how I had cancelled a ride beforehand, and so he assumed that this ride was just a bit of a mix-up, and so he told the guy that the ride was cancelled, and apparently the driver was pretty upset about this, but he ended up leaving, and so he didn't think too much of it. And so, later that day, I attempted to file a report through the rideshare platform, and I was advised to contact local authorities about it because apparently they had not sent that person. When I submitted a police statement, I was informed, though, that without a license plate number or clear identifying information, really that no action could be taken. The platform declined responsibility pending police findings, and after that, no follow-up occurred. After that, though, I stopped using that service permanently. Never again is what I kept telling myself, and I adjusted my travel habits too. These days, too, I always check vehicle details, share trip progress with others, and always avoid solo rides, especially during early morning hours, whenever I can. I had a close, dear friend years ago. We went to high school together and instantly became close as we enjoyed the same, well, everything pretty much. Movies, games, activities, and so on. This friend had a beautiful cottage in Muskoka, which was about an hour and a bit from the area that we lived in. They would talk about it a bunch, saying how awesome it was to go there in the summer as it was right by a river and was perfect for swimming and paddleboarding and all that. They also said that it was kind of haunted though, just a passing comment about how it was spooky, how they'd hear things at night, how it was probably home to a ghost. They always said this jokingly, like it was no big deal, so we'd usually laugh at the idea that their beautiful and pretty much newly built cottage was actually a ghost house. Fast forward a couple of years and they invite me out to their cottage in October. The family was going up and my friend asked if I could come with them. I was super excited to go because I'd never really been to Muskoka and knew how beautiful it could be, especially in the fall, and also how often my friend mentioned the fun that they'd have at that cottage. I want to now preface what comes next with the fact that I have never had any paranormal stuff happen to me, ever. I don't disbelieve it and never have, but I've never been in a position where I'd feel like, okay, this is definitely paranormal stuff, until this event. So we get to where the cottage is located in this small community called Matthiasville. As soon as we enter, I just get this weird feeling, like a shadow had been cast over me. It was a beautiful sunny day with good vibes, all the way up until we crossed the bridge that led into the community. The weather suddenly turned overcast, but it wasn't that. There was a heavy and weird energy there. We're driving along the riverside for some time, and I tell my friend about the energy feeling, to which they said, "Oh, I know, it's weird, right? Like heavy." Things lighten up. However, when we arrive at the cottage, this place was absolutely beautiful. New build, 3 floors, big deck on the 2nd floor, and tons of windows that went floor to ceiling. It overlooked the river and it had a forest trail at the back even. The trail was way too thick with brush and wood to even try to navigate, so we spent a lot of our time out by the water and on the big deck just sort of chilling. We drive into the nearest town, Bracebridge, for some outings, and at night we dedicated our time to beating the COD World at War campaign split screen. It was an absolute blast. We went for a long day walk too and saw some of the interesting points of Matthiasville, a big dam, and beyond that a strange and small sort of graveyard that was situated on a slight hill at the very tip end of the community. All the graves were pretty old and some of them were unmarked. Others you couldn't even make out what the stones had written on them. It was eerie, but nothing out of the ordinary happened for the first 2 nights that we spent there, so I just thought that it was all a nothing burger. Now, on the 3rd and last night, the dad had to head home early for some work stuff, so it was just my friend, their mum, and myself hanging out for the night. The mum was sleeping in the loft way up on the 3rd floor, and we made the basement floor our home for the weekend. We decided to watch a movie and eat some snacks, but when that was finished, I suggested that we go out for a night walk since it was a clear night with a big moon out, and I loved going for night strolls. Plus, we hadn't really been out and about after dark, and the place was pretty beautiful at night too. My friend, though, was really against this. They said that the place was spooky enough during the day, let alone at night. But I managed to convince them, and so out we went. We were walking along the road that went along the river, towards the dam and the end of the community where the graveyard was. We made it about a quarter of the way when my friend stopped dead in their tracks. I looked back to see what was up, and they were just sort of standing there, and they looked defensive. I asked what was up, and they said, "We need to go back, like now. This feels weird and I don't like it at all." I asked if they were scared, like if they heard an animal or something. And as soon as I asked that, we heard what I can only describe as a deep and loud crackling and snapping of wood in the dense forest above us, on a rocky ridge that was beside the road, opposite side of the river. I looked up to where we heard it, and it suddenly felt like everything just hushed. Crickets and all other nighttime sounds seemed to have just completely stopped. My friend quietly said my name. I looked back at them, and then suddenly, the bushes and the shrubs underneath the ridge on the other side of the road just exploded, as if something huge jumped in them and thrashed around. This made us bolt, and I remember just saying "run" as I followed behind my friend. We ran non-stop straight to the basement door of the cottage. We got there in minutes, but it felt like seconds. We ran straight into the basement bedroom, and we both hopped into the bed. I remember saying that it was likely a coyote or a raccoon or something, but as soon as I said those words, a creaking started forming up above us in the living area of the first floor. The creaking soon turned into slow, heavy footsteps, back and forth, and loud as if someone was wearing work boots or something. I remember my friend through tears saying, "Does that sound like a coyote to you?" I cannot even describe the absolute feeling of dread that just suddenly washed over me, like there was something up there taunting us. We lay in complete silence for what felt like hours. We got into the bed at around 3 a.m. after our walk, which turned into a run, and the footsteps didn't stop for an hour or so at least. Eventually, I remember finally falling asleep at about 6 in the morning. When we woke up, the first thing that we did, of course, was ask the mum if she had been awake last night at around 3 a.m., and she assured us that she wasn't. She hadn't even gotten up once to use the bathroom, she said. Even if she did, we should have been able to have heard her door open and then the footsteps down the loft stairs. I mean, everything was open concept on the first floor, so it was easy to hear things going on there. After that, though, we packed up and left, and my friend's parents sold the cottage a couple of years later, and I don't think any of them went back once after that weekend. I was curious about the area afterward, though, so I eventually did some Googling and learned that there was once a sawmill or something like that, and a tragic accident happened there. I believe the owner's son drowned or had a bad accident in the mill or something tragic like that. I want to say that that could be a factor here, but honestly, who knows? All I know is that night, I heard heavy, clear, and loud footsteps pacing around above us on the first floor. And that was my first and only paranormal experience that I will never, ever forget. In 1982, I and 6 buddies went bear hunting in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We stayed at cabins near Twin Lakes at the base of the Keweenaw Peninsula. Now, when you hunt most critters, you go out before dawn and sit until an hour or two after the sun comes up, and late afternoon until dark. Most bigger game animals hunker down during the daylight hours, so it doesn't pay to sit there all day. And this means that you have a lot of time between hunts. Now, this part of the Upper Peninsula has some remote areas. It is also where a lot of copper mining went on in the old days. The mines are all closed now, obviously, and mostly full of water, but there are a lot of big paper mill holdings there also that are still being logged. So there's a lot of logging roads built up by the paper mills. They are good enough roads for large double trailer log trucks filled with many tons of logs to travel on. One thing that you learn quickly when you use these roads is to get the heck off the road when a truck is coming down, because they take up the whole road, and they don't even slow down for civilians because the mill owns the roads, not the state or the county, and you're on their land technically. But as long as you don't get in their way, then they don't care. Most of the bridges across streams or rivers just consist of huge piles of large rocks with smaller gravel on top of the road. These things look like dams, to be honest, but because of the large bottom rocks, the water can flow through the bridge. Genuinely, it's a pretty cool thing to see. We spent a lot of time driving and exploring those logging roads too. On one particular day, we went down a new road that led to an actual state park at the bottom of Misery Bay on Lake Superior. It's a park maintained by the state on paper mill property. There are several very rustic sort of campsites at the park, and we spent most of the time at the park and just messing around on the beach, really. At about noon, we headed back down a different road. It's around this time, too, that you see a lot of small shacks that usually have smoke coming out of the chimneys. They're apparently used by the loggers, I think. We eventually ended up way out in the wilderness with no signs of logging or logging trucks anywhere. It's a bit like driving in a tunnel, in fact, because the trees come together over the road here. But after a long while, we came into a clear area, and then around a bend, we came upon what we thought was a small town. The road basically went right down a main street, and as we drove through the place, it became apparent that There were no people to be seen. We came to a building that was kind of a store, I guess, so we stopped there. The store was completely empty. Looking in the dusty windows, you could see that it had been empty for a long time. We walked around the main street, checking out the houses. A lot of them were in pretty good repair, but they were completely deserted. Dust on the floors had been undisturbed for many years, and there were no signs of foot traffic anywhere. We eventually got back into the trucks and moved on. We were all pretty intrigued by the town, but we didn't go into any of the houses because, well, it just sort of looked like the owners might actually come back at any point. The main street, it went up a pretty big hill, and at the top of the hill was a large building that was obviously some kind of industrial use building, covered in that old sort of galvanized corrugated metal sheeting. We stopped at the building and found an opening in the siding. The inside of the building was wide open and it was very tall, like 30 to 40 feet tall, with a lot of supporting steelwork. Everything was pretty rusty and obviously hadn't been touched in many years. There were large windows with no glass, just sort of open to the outside high up in the walls that allowed the sun to light it up pretty well inside. At the center of the place, there was a large hole in the floor though, like 15 to 20 feet square. We peered down into the opening and it was a really deep and dark hole. Somebody dropped a stone down the hole and it was a long time before you could hear a faint splash of water. So we dropped another stone and we had a couple of those old Casio watches with a stopwatch function, so we dropped the rock and timed it to the splash. And it took almost exactly 10 seconds. There were no guardrails, mind you, or safety measures of any kind here, and it was pretty scary thinking about falling into that deep black hole. There was also some old equipment left there that looked to be like turn-of-the-century type stuff. We assumed it was a closed copper mine, but the whole time we were exploring, we had two 35mm film cameras taking a lot of pictures. This was 30 years before cell phones and 35 to 40 before smartphones. After exploring the place for a while, we decided that it was time to get going because we only had a few hours before dark. Now, after miles of running down those unmarked roads, we eventually made it back to the cabins. We all went to our hunting spots, and after it got dark, we all headed back to the local bar where we usually went to get something to eat. One of the guys asked the lady bartender if she knew anything about that shutdown mine and abandoned town, and she got a kind of funny look on her face and went to the kitchen pass-through window and said, "Hey Dave, these guys went and visited Peterson." We all looked at each other like, what the heck is she talking about? The kitchen door opened up and then a cook apparently called Dave came out, dressed in typical bar cook clothes. Dave came over and said, "What did you see in Peterson?" We said, first of all, we never saw a sign with a name on it, but it was just an abandoned town and pretty decent looking buildings, and a closed down copper mine up on the hill. Dave then said, "Yep, that's Peterson. Some people see signs going into town and some don't. The thing is that there never was a Peterson. It never existed." We were like, "What are you talking about? I mean, we were there, looked into the buildings, dropped rocks down the empty mine shaft, and even took many pictures." Dave then said, "Yep, you and many other people, but if you try to return, I guarantee you won't find it." We were like, "What? We know the road that we took. We could get back there easily, man." And he said, "Go ahead and try. You won't find it." Dave also asked if we by any chance dropped a rock in the hole and timed it to the bottom. And yes, actually we did, and it took almost exactly 10 seconds like we said. Dave then said, "I did too, and I looked it up. A falling rock, or anything really, falls about 400 feet in 10 seconds. He then said that Peterson is a real ghost town. The whole place is a real ghost town, he said. He said that he was there and saw the same things years ago. Apparently, he'd tried many times to go back and he'd never been able to find it. Him and a lot of other people who lived in this area and know it like the backs of their hands have seen it once and once only, never being able to find it again." Dave said to go to Houghton Hancock and to get our film developed and to let him see the pictures. So the next day, we decided to take off from hunting and go up to town and get the film developed. Hancock is home to Michigan Tech, so it's a college town with all the amenities, and it had a quick film developer place, so we dropped the film off and went to see the sights. It's a really picturesque place too, and I highly recommend you go and check it out if you ever get the chance. Anyway, about an hour northeast of Hancock is Copper Harbor at the very top of Michigan, where it ends into Lake Superior. It's a really cool place, and when we got back to Hancock, we were dying to see the pictures, so we went and got the film and tore open the envelopes. But there were a lot of pictures, beautiful pictures, but weirdly, not a single picture of Peterson. We were thinking, hold up, wait a minute, this isn't possible. So a couple of guys went back to the film place and asked where the other pictures that were on those rolls were. But in the end, there were no other pictures. We had all the negatives. They don't keep other people's pictures apparently, and they see thousands every month. Now, there's a park in town, and we stopped there and all sat at that table just kind of in shock really, not saying much for quite a while. In 1982, I was 23 years old, and at 23, you think you know it all, but when you're hit square in the face by something like that, it shook me to the core. Everything that you think you know is now suspect because, we were in that abandoned town. It was just a cool old abandoned town. I saw it with my own eyes in the wide open sunny broad daylight, not on some dark foggy creepy night. Nothing creepy happened, but we took those pictures. Pictures that apparently don't exist. Well, that changed my life from that point forward. After that, we went back to see Dave and gave him the stack of pictures of the woods, the Big Mac Bridge, Misery Bay, the park on the bay, logging trucks, the rock bridges, some of the shacks, one of which was just about 2 miles from Peterson. Dave just kind of chuckled and said, "Yep, that's our Peterson, all right." For the next 2 days, we totally forgot about hunting. We split up into 2 trucks and we drove those roads over and over and over again, and we never refound Peterson. Years ago, I was in rehab for drug addiction. I did 5 months in rehab, then 6 months of sober living following that. This occurred the last few weeks of being in rehab before going to sober living. Now, I met hundreds of addicts. In fact, new people would come and go on a daily basis. A lot of these people were much worse off than others, and everyone was in for different things. A lot of these people that came in also had a plethora of mental health issues and mental illnesses. Severe depression, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and many others. But I'll never forget the day that Mike, a 30 to 40-year-old male, was admitted. A lot of the techs that worked at the rehab informed all of the patients about Mike and his condition. He had a case of severe schizophrenia and would constantly be talking to no one. He would get really agitated and upset at times at these voices, and would often yell and have a panic attack. It was very sad, to be honest, and it wasn't like this would happen sometimes. This was ongoing, like a 24/7 problem that, unfortunately, Mike had to deal with. The rehab was situated in an old motel-like complex, except it was much, much nicer, like a fancy hotel. Girls across the street in identical buildings. Everyone was assigned to a specific room with 2 to 3 other patients, and when Mike showed up, he was placed in the unit that I was in. I introduced myself to him and shook his hand. He seemed so timid and nervous, but I gave a rundown of how things work and a rough daily schedule for our program. I showed him his room and I told him not to hesitate to ask me for anything. Before I walked away, I told him, "Mike, we're all in here for our own reasons. I just want you to know that there's no judgment whatsoever on my end, and that no matter what you may be dealing with, you can come to me and confide in me for anything you like, man." He partially grinned at that and nodded at me. And that was the last time that we spoke for the 2 weeks that he was there. Now, that evening, I was watching TV in the living room of our unit when I heard him start aggressively talking to himself. The strange thing is that it literally sounded like he was having a legit conversation. I heard him say, "Don't say that, shut up." And then 5 seconds later he said, "I'm not going to do that, leave me alone." And then a few seconds after that, "Get out of here." This was expected because I was informed of his condition, but hearing him have an episode the first time made me feel, well, really bad for him. But then, things took a very odd turn over the following days. A few days after Mike was placed in my unit, I woke up one morning to go make some coffee. I was in the kitchen, and Mike's room was down the hallway. I was pulling out a coffee filter when I heard clear as day, "What are you doing?" I turned around expecting to see Mike, but no one was there. Then I hear Mike all the way from the room scream, "Ah, get out of here." I was very, very confused and didn't know what to make of it, and kind of just shrugged it off. I was pretty alarmed by this though, but things kept happening. It was later in the week when I was in the living room watching TV again when I heard Mike having another conversation with himself, but this time I could distinctly hear a second voice. I thought to myself, does he have a split personality and is having a conversation between himself and his other self? The other voice was so much different, and I kept telling myself, Mike's just really, really good at imitating other voices or something. I turned the volume down on the TV so that I could hear more of this conversation. Mike says, "I told you no, I'm not going to do that. Leave me alone, please." The other voice responds, "Just go and do what I tell you. It's for the best." Mike responds, "No, that's bad. I won't do it." The other voice then responds, "Go to the kitchen and get the knife now." Then Mike let out a huge scream of despair. I sat there on that couch in just disbelief. My brain couldn't comprehend what I was hearing or what was happening. I suddenly got a huge sense of dread that came over me. I got up and started making my way to his door to check on him, and as I got closer, the conversation was becoming much more audible and clear to hear. There were 2 people in that room. I was certain of it, and nothing is ever going to change my mind about that. As I heard the other voice trying to persuade Mike again, I knocked on his door and the voice stopped immediately. I opened the door to tell Mike that I heard him scream and wanted to see if he was okay. It was just him sitting on the chair with his head in his hands like he just got some really bad news. He looked up at me and said, "I'm fine, thanks. Please shut the door." I immediately went to our head nurse and explained to her that Mike was saying some pretty scary things and that I was in fear of my life being in the same room as him. I mentioned to her hearing him talk to himself about a knife, and that was all it took for them to take Mike and relocate to somewhere else where he could get the help that he needed. To this day, I think about this experience that I had with Mike and try to find a reasonable explanation for what happened and what I heard. I've never heard voices or had hallucinations at any other point. I've been clean of drugs for years now, but this was just an experience that I had that has made me question reality and everything. Honestly, I feel like he didn't have schizophrenia, but that maybe he was possessed. I think about this often and I still cannot come to terms with it. I guess I want closure about it, and it's just something that I'll probably never get. So, that's my story, and if you've listened to everything, well then, thanks. This is probably the weirdest paranormal or unexplainable experience that I've had. Other than feeling someone poke their finger in my back when laying on my side in the bed, this one pretty much tops it. I work swing shifts, so when I get home from work, everyone is usually asleep. I usually watch some TV to unwind before going to bed, and because of that, I always make sure the bedroom doors are closed so I don't wake up my wife and kids. Now, when I got home one evening, I noticed the master bedroom door was closed but not latched, so I figured that should be fine. But a few minutes later, I hear psst coming from the master bedroom. I look, and now the door is ajar enough to stick your head out. I figured the wife is feeling frisky, so I jump up and walk into the bedroom. But she is in bed covered up, and I'm thinking, she's pretending to be asleep. I climb in bed and tell her to stop playing. She wakes up though, and I could tell that she wasn't pretending. We've been married a long time now, so I know how she is when she wakes up. Long story short, I explained to her what happened, and she's weirded out like I was. Genuinely, it made my skin crawl, and it was hard to fall asleep that night. Ever since that night, I randomly feel something around me too, like the hair on my neck will stand up. I feel like I'm being watched.